Throughout the years, there have been numerous military conflicts all across the world. All of them cost money, some more than others. However, each of these has cost a huge amount of money that we simply can't wrap our heads around it. So join us as we uncover some of the most expensive military conflicts that have ever existed. Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War lasted only 4 months and is often considered to be the first media war. It all began when the USS Maine unexpectedly blew up in 1898 and cries for American intervention increased. Congress quickly declared war. The war led to the United States emerging predominant in the Caribbean region and resulted in the US acquisition of Spain's Pacific possessions as well as the involvement of the US in the Philippines Revolution. The US ended up spending $10.3 billion on this war, and in the end they gained Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The result of the war made America emerge as a global power, and Spain lost control over the remains of its overseas empire. Persian Gulf War. It might have been one of the shortest conflicts in US history, but that doesn't mean that it didn't cost a lot. The conflict cost $61 billion, which today would be $116 billion. It all began in 1991 when tensions mounted in the Middle East when Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The US made numerous calls for Iraq to smash that like button if you haven't done so already. But no, they made numerous calls for Iraq to withdraw. However, when Hussein refused, it began the US involvement in the Persian Gulf War. 2/3 of the 21 countries in the Arab League, including Egypt and Saudi Arabia, asked the US and its allies to intervene. When the conflict began, 39 countries joined the Allied coalition against Iraq and its defenders. The war kicked off with an air offense led by the US known as Operation Desert Storm. The offensive lasted 42 days and ended in catastrophe for Iraq. Hussein agreed to acknowledge Kuwait's sovereignty. American Civil War. For 4 years, the American Civil War managed to take the lives of over 750,000 people. The war, which began in 1861, was fought over the issues of slavery and states' rights. The war was fought between the Union and the Confederacy, and by the end of the war, to keep the US united and abolish slavery cost around $80 billion. The conflict began after South Carolina seceded from the Union in 1861. The conflict laid waste to most of the South and left the region devastated for years. The main cause of the conflict was the dispute over whether slavery would be permitted to expand into the Western territories, leading to more slave states, or be prevented from doing so. The Civil War ended the plantation system and the institution of slavery in the South, but it cost the US a ton of money throughout the 4 years. Korean War. Known as the Forgotten War for its lack of media attention, the Korean War was a major military conflict that began in 1950 and lasted for 3 years and 1 month. This conflict marked the beginning of the Cold War. It was essentially a conflict between the anti-communist Republic of Korea and the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Today, they are known as South and North Korea. When the conflict began, each side was supported by other allies. The Republic of Korea was backed by the US, while the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was backed by the Soviet Union. Over the course of 3 years, the Korean War claimed nearly 5 million lives. The war ended in 1953 when the feuding countries signed an armistice that created a new boundary between North and South Korea. It has been estimated that around $389 billion were spent throughout the conflict. Vietnam War. One of the longest and most complicated military conflicts in US history was the Vietnam War. It lasted for 19 years and 5 months, throughout which over $843 billion were spent. The US involvement in the conflict took place in 1955, a year after Vietnam split into 2 territories. The conflict continued through 4 presidential administrations in the US. In 1973, American troops withdrew and South Vietnam fell to Communist North Vietnam. In 1975, when a peace agreement was signed. However, battles between North and South Vietnam continued. In total, the conflict took more than 3 million lives and is still considered to be one of the longest conflicts that have existed in history. Iraq War. The conflict in Iraq ended up costing a shocking $1 trillion, and it lasted for 7 years and 5 months. It all began when the US invaded Iraq in 2003 and overthrew Saddam Hussein. The true motives of the Iraq conflict remain controversial. However, it was believed that Iraq was harboring weapons of mass destruction and saw its support to various dangerous groups. The entire conflict officially concluded in 2011, but there are still many US troops remaining in the region. The conflict also aimed to remove Hussein and create a democratic country for the people of Iraq. This long-lasting conflict resulted in the deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians, and today, many people still reflect on it as one of the most dangerous wars that have existed in the 21st century. War of 1812. One of the earliest wars in U.S. history was the War of 1812. This conflict proved to be a financial debacle for the ages and one that took nearly 20 years to pay off. The cost of this conflict ended up being $2.8 trillion. The conflict began in 1812 and lasted for nearly 3 years. It began when the U.S. claimed the British were trying to limit trade and were forcing U.S. sailors to serve in the Royal Navy. The U.S. declared war, and although peace terms were agreed upon in the 1814 Treaty of Ghent, the conflict didn't officially end until the peace treaty was ratified by Congress in 1815. The Treaty of Ghent ended the conflict with the U.S. retaining its sovereignty, but America was prevented from expanding northward into Canada. World War I. When it came to finances, it's safe to say that nobody won this war, as it ended up costing $3.3 trillion. Most of the money for this war came from Germany, which spent $686 billion, followed by the US and the Brits. When the war broke out in Europe in 1914, the US was neutral for 3 years. However, after 3 years, the US agreed to smash that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. But no, in all seriousness, the US agreed to lend money mostly to France and Great Britain. Gradually, the US was pulled into the conflict due to Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare against all ships bound for the nations it was fighting. America was compelled to act, which is why they declared war against Germany in 1917. World War I ended 19 months later, costing the lives of more than 116,000 troops. During this conflict, America ended up spending $334 billion. World War II. A conflict more costly than World War I was the Second World War, which lasted for 6 years and it cost $4.7 trillion. World War II is by far the biggest conflict any of us can think of, and due to that, it goes without saying that it's among the most expensive ones. This global conflict began in 1939 and lasted until 1945, when the vast majority of the world's countries fought as part of two opposing military alliances known as the Allies and the Axis. This military conflict was by far the deadliest in human history. It resulted in 70 to 85 million fatalities, mostly among civilians. Most of the major powers across the globe spend a serious amount of money on this conflict, with the US possibly spending the most money on a military conflict. When the war ended, the US and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's biggest superpowers and became rivals in the Cold War. Cold War. The Cold War was a vast and extremely costly period of armament and conflict that cost numerous nations quite a lot in the areas of defense and espionage. Technically, World War II is the most expensive war ever fought, but the Cold War is still regarded as a war, even if troops never invaded anywhere for a big throwdown. The war began in 1947 and lasted until 1991, which forced many of the nations to spend more than they thought. The total estimated cost for this conflict was $5.8 trillion. The conflict was a result of the growing tension between the US and the Soviet Union, who entered this conflict without fighting directly. With the dissolution of Soviet Union in 1991, the Cold War concluded, but it made an impact on history as the only conflict that didn't require fighting, but also as the most expensive one in history. See you in the next video.